Greetings. Welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. In 1995, the General Assembly established the Connecticut Freedom Trail as a way to recognize African Americans, the Black community, and other marginalized groups' story about fight for freedom, social equity, and there are sites that mark or bear witness to these quests. My name is Tammy Denease, and today we have with us President and CEO Maisa Tisdale from the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center for History and Community. Since 2009, after coordinating a successful movement to save the homes from demolition, Ms. Tisdale led the Freeman Center as a volunteer until 2019. Then she became the Freeman Center's first professional staff member. Over the past 10 years, Ms. Tisdale not only focused on the restoration of the Freeman houses, but has worked to create a safer and healthier built environment in Bridgeport's South End, focusing on historic preservation, community development, and climate change. Ms. Tisdale got her undergraduate at Yale University, where she earned a BA in Asian Studies. She also studied sociology and history as a postgraduate special student at Columbia University. Maisa Tisdale went on to work as a private contractor for the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, and for many years, and has worked as the executive director of the Ocean Classroom in Bridgeport, assistant director of admissions at Fairfield University, and manager of sponsorships and grants at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. Today, she will talk about the homes in Bridgeport. Maisa, welcome.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here today. So, yes, I will talk about the homes today, and I would also like to talk about the challenges in establishing a site that actually recovers a history that's forgotten. There are extra preservation challenges as well as extra historical research challenges. So I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen. All right. Greetings from the Freeman Center. Is my screen being shared properly? I will take that as a yes. So this little girl is me. This is Maisa Tisdale. And I feel that I was almost destined to do this kind of work, and that this project, in a very interesting way, found its way to me. When I was a little girl, my parents were civil rights activists. I'm sorry, I'm having a problem. Can you actually see when I was sharing this? I'm having a little problem. When I was sharing the screen before, were you seeing a full image?
Yes.
Okay, so let me try again. So my parents had to make a decision. They realized that they planned a future for me without limitations. They never wanted me to think that there was something that I couldn't do because of my gender or because of my color. And they had to figure out how to make sure that I had a sense of self-esteem and understood the history that I came from, the story of my people. They had realized long ago that life as they knew it, their families' experiences weren't reflected in history books. they weren't mirrored in mass media. And my family, perhaps like many others, had passed on an oral history that paralleled the formal education that we had in school. And so they worked very hard to protect that legacy and make sure that I knew as much about myself and my own history as the histories and narratives I was taught in school. So this is me at 10 years old with a new afro and a dashiki dress. And at this time, my parents were actively involved in curating my education and presenting my history. History became a family affair from the time that I was a little girl. We had this beat up green Rambler. I don't even know if people remember what Ramblers looked like. And we would make this treacherous drive to New York City as many weekends as we could. Back then, there was no internet, there was no online, there was no way to research anything unless you went to a library. If you wanted to buy books, you actually had to drive to a bookstore and buy them. And if you wanted Black books, there was nowhere for us to buy them in Connecticut. So my parents would pack us all up in a car, and we would spend weekends at Barnes and Noble's outlet in their warehouse in New York City. And we would split up, and all of us, my brother, me, my parents, me at this age and younger, and we would start scouring the warehouse for Black books. And we'd all meet at the cash register at a predetermined time, look at our treasures, and we're thrilled to death to take them home. My parents actually established their prized Black bookshelf, and neighbors used to come to our house, our apartment, and read books off of the shelf, because my mom had a policy. You could sit in our house, in our living room, as long as you wanted. She'd even feed you meals and read the books on the shelf, but you could not take the books out of the house. Well, after a while, the Black bookshelf became a Black book wall, and then we had problems after a while finding spaces for the books in the house. But this was the only access to African American history and culture that was available to me, to my peers, to my neighbors. So let's talk about Little Liberia. And it was surprising to me, to my mother, to my family, that they didn't have an oral tradition that included Little Liberia. So why would that be a surprise? Well, 6 generations of my family have either been born or lived in Bridgeport. And so one would think that a place that had as much significance during its own time, well, there would be some memory, maybe not among everyone else in the larger culture, but in this parallel oral history that so many families shared with their children. But we had no memory of the place. Little Liberia is on the water. Its geography is very important for its significance. And that's just a Google shot of where Little Liberia is located. So it would have been south of the railroad tracks. It would have come to about here, gone behind the gate of the utilities. And this is all landfill. So they would have been more directly on the water. So I mentioned that the geography is very important. It's very important not just for the history of Little Liberia, but for the aspirations of the Freeman Center and how we'd like to study our history. And again, this history was forgotten, but it was not invisible. And so what it has highlighted for us is the need for a digital humanities approach to reconstructing the history of this place. This particular map was provided to me from NOAA. NOAA traces its roots back to Thomas Jefferson when it was a government department that specialized in coastal surveys. NOAA also has a social science office, which I didn't know about, and they were really cute. They said, well, don't be too impressed. It's not very big. It has like 3 people. But it's really interesting that there is an archive of data, of maps that trace the coastal communities from a very, very early time. So this map is a map from 1848, which is the same year that Mary and Eliza Freeman had actually built their houses. And what they wanted me to see is this area right here. And that's actually Little Liberia. So it shows up on the 1848 survey, the survey map from the predecessor office that is now NOAA. And again, what you'll notice is the access to the water. We didn't realize the significance of the spatial positioning of Little Liberia for quite a while, and now we understand that that's important indeed. And there's a close-up, and let's see, the Mary and Eliza Freeman houses would be over here. This is actually a picture of the schooner Ernestina, one of my favorite vessels. I was a deckhand on this ship, and it also gave me an idea of what it was like to be on the sea, and the ability that the water gave people, even in the most oppressive times, to reach beyond their locality. So both in terms of the geographical advantage of supplying your needs of food, like fishing and oystering and things like that from the sea, Little Liberia was in a unique position where it could participate in the Underground Railroad by water as an Underground Railroad destination settlement. So we all talk about where people got onto the Underground Railroad. As it turns out, this 1821 settlement in Little Liberia, it was founded in that year, was a destination. It was where people got off of the ship, but got off of the vessel, and people were able to start a new life. They could either learn a trade, get on their feet, or they could establish a business if they already had an established trade. For example, barbering or making vessels, oystering. But the geographical position is also important because it helped generate the wealth for the investment and the establishment of this settlement. So many of the men of Little Liberia were in fact seamen. It was the only place where a Black man, a Native man, could make as much money as a white man. So they would bring their money back to the community. The women started businesses. They managed that money. Mary and Eliza were involved in real estate development. They made mortgages to other people. You see businesses founded on women's skills as traditionally what were considered women's skills as well, like laundry businesses, but on an almost industrial scale it was a smaller place back then, but basically laundry services, not just as a personal endeavor, but for the community around it. So what the sea contributed, besides freedom, besides growing different entrepreneurial skills, it also redefined gender roles in a way, because at that time, white women couldn't even vote. In a lot of the enterprises that Little Liberia's women were involved in, we don't think of as characteristic or as typical for women of of that time. So even women who had outside work, so for example, Mary Freeman worked as a chef in New York, and her sister Eliza worked in the home of a widow. They took their earnings and they invested it in real estate. And so being in a situation where they were on the water and they had a reach and they had an awareness of being part of a Black Atlantic community, it allowed this place to prosper. This is a painting that's part of our collection that was painted at the time. The painter was 19 years old. He was from Kenya, and he was reflecting the whaling tradition of Little Liberia. So this is William Sherman. William Sherman was a leader in the Golden Hill Pagusset community, and he was also a resident of Little Liberia. Now, this is what becomes really interesting about this place. When we build a chronological timeline, the kind that you would build for a listing in the register, the National Register of Historic Places, you tend to look really, really locally at what happened in this place and what happened next and what happened next and what happened next. But as you start studying Little Liberia, all of a sudden there are questions that come to mind that say, you know, these questions aren't being really understood by just looking at local history alone. And we had questions that came to light that didn't really have answers. And why were people in this area born in so many different places, both in the United States, up and down the seacoast? Why were they born in the Caribbean? How do you explain the presence of people from so many different places? Well, just looking at the local history, that answer wasn't really clear. So this is what Charles Brilvich, who uncovered and researched this story, this is what he encountered in our South End neighborhood. The business in front was a thriving tailor shop. Charles had been conducting an inventory of cultural assets, and this was back in the 1980s, to see what the different neighborhoods in Bridgeport could offer to economic redevelopment of the area. And he came across this house, which was clearly different in size and scale and age from anything around it. And he realized that there was a story, a historical story that hadn't been told. And this is what the community looks like today. So you can tell from this landscape, there's very little sign that there was an early significant settlement of free people of color. This landscape encases a history that was lost to modern memory. So what distinguishes Little Liberia from other settlements of free people of color? First of all, that it was very early. The first people who bought land here, they established the community in 1821. The second part of it was its prosperity. But the other part of it has to do with its political and cultural significance and what we can understand. So now this brings me back to my childhood pictures and photos. The intended audience for a historical narrative determines the methods that you'll go about researching a history. The questions that are asked by a particular community are often not the questions asked by another. So people who are looking at the Little Liberia story from the outside might ask different questions than the community around it or African American people who want to understand their history. So what becomes significant about Little Liberia isn't just the fact that this is an early community of color. It's a piece in the larger story of the African diaspora. So when I do talks to everyone from adults to little school children, they basically ask me the same questions. And it boils down to, how did we come to be here? How is it that we have this experience? How is it that we live like this? And the answer to this question, even for the city of Bridgeport, is much bigger than Little Liberia in the stories that these two houses tell us. And we didn't realize that until we joined the local story of the origins of Little Liberia. We had to enlarge the scope and take a different sort of spatial approach to this place. We had to step beyond this location. We had to step beyond this time. So in recovering the story, we managed, Charles Brilvich did a masterful job, which he continued as city historian, and he continues to this day of looking at this community. This is a map of Bridgeport from the 1850s. And I can only imagine how many different pairs of eyes looked at this map from the 1850s to the 1980s. And the circle is where Little Liberia is. And we've seen from the map that Noah provided that the community was even visible in 1848 from the coastal surveys. But how does a story get lost? Well, it gets lost because it's not of significance to the people who are studying history. The historians didn't consider, first of all, they didn't acknowledge in the days of slavery that African American people had a history. That was part of the basis upon which slavery was based, that slavery actually elevated people of African descent because we had no history, we made no contributions to humanity. We were little more than beasts of burden. And so enslaving us actually elevated us, gave us a purpose, and introduced us to, and made us productive because we could produce wealth for someone else. Well, of course, that's not true. But if you look at the physical landscape in our country for historic sites and structures that are tied to African American history, you don't find, over time, you don't find very many. And but the evidence was there on the same documents and the same archives that were used to produce the narrative that so many came to know of this country, a narrative of exclusion. So that circle is where Little Liberia is. And this is the map that Charles Brilvich turned to first to find information about this place. He turned to it because next to every single box on the map, which is a property, there's the name of the owner of the property. So he successfully estimated the time, the age of these dwellings. 1848, went to 1850 map. When he gets down to the place where Little Liberia is, you'll notice that none of these boxes have names next to them. So what was the giveaway? That this was, in fact, a community of free people of color? There were two labels: North African Church and South African Church. So again, you can find information about Little Liberia and start resurrecting this history with data that's already in archives. Later on, when we were campaigning to save the houses from demolition, a local architect superimposed the boxes that Charles worked so hard to associate with property owners, and it was superimposed on a map, not in correct proportion, but that was the first time that any of us had seen the community in this way. This is actually where our center gallery is, and a mural on the side of the wall depicting Mary and Eliza Freeman. We have no images of them. It's an artist's rendition. Again, their entire narrative was erased and then reconstructed through through artifacts that tied to their entrepreneurial enterprises. So titles, deeds, also obituaries and the like. And this is a congregation at Walter's Church. And here again, the idea that maybe this community was aware of things in a different way. At one time, a congregant from Walter's Memorial said, "We don't really remember the history of our church. But we're thinking that you do, or you can find it out for us. We're just not that aware of why our church has this name." So this congregation traces its origins back to the original congregation of Little Liberia, and one of those original African churches that's marked on the map. And that congregation still exists today, although the historic church has not been restored or preserved and is closed and not used, and the stained glass Christ, the Black depiction of Christ, has been removed and such. But the church was named after Bishop Walters, who, interestingly enough, spoke to 40,000, an audience of 40,000 in London in 1900. And he's credited for being one of the early founders of the Pan-African movement. And if you see here, it says this conference is organized by a committee of the African Association for discussion of the native races question, and will be attended and addressed by those of African descent from all parts of the British Empire, the United States of America, Abyssinia, Liberia, and Haiti. So when we look at Little Liberia in early times, we find representatives, we find people living there from the British Empire, from Haiti, people of color from other places in the world. We find ties to the colored convention movement, with an early colored convention taking place in Little Liberia before 1841. And we can reconstruct pictures of life in Little Liberia from a letter that Frederick Douglass published in his newspaper that describes life here in great detail. And one of his correspondents was staying at the luxury seaside resort that was here, that catered to wealthy Black people from New York City. We find that when it came time for the Civil War, over 300 Black men or men of color actually enlisted from Bridgeport. Now, we don't know that they lived here, but they enlisted from here. And they originated from states and throughout the country, and they were born in places as far as India, Canada, Latin America. And so we have to ask, what was going on here that made this a place where this diversity of men of color would enlist from this place? That's what the houses will look like when they're done. So again, who you tell, why you tell the story has an impact on how you research the story. My parents would have wanted me to know this story as a child. They would have passed this story on to me had it still remained in modern memory. When I try to answer questions in classes, and as the Freeman Center determines how it will do its research, how it will resurrect the story of Little Liberia, because unlike some historic sites that are well established, the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we actually have to do the research to reassemble this history. And so we need people who are like trained, we need trained archaeologists. We need trained historians. But we also, in order to understand this story, needed to revisit the audience. So what do I want to know? What do the children in school in Bridgeport want to know about their past? They want to know where they came from, how they got here, and why they live the way they do. And Little Liberia has these answers, but not if you perceive of the map this way, not if this is your spatial reference. And so Charles Brilvich brought us the local story of Little Liberia, and Dr. Jamila Moore Pugh took that story and placed it within the context of the Black Atlantic. And just how we're taught to see a map in the 4th grade, this is how I was taught to see the United States and my place in it as a 4th grader. The Little Liberians actually saw the map like this. Here they were, and they made multiple and numerous crossings in this area. And that's how this diverse population came to be in this multi-ethnic enclave. But beyond that, they had a sense of self that also mirrored this. So political influences, cultural influences, cuisine, people. This is my story. And these are the things that I really wanted to know, and that African American people want to know as they reassemble the history of their families and of themselves. And it brings to mind a quote, and I'm sorry, I don't remember who made it. Maybe someone can look it up. but I do remember the quote pretty much word for word. And here it is. It's, all faith is false. All faith is true. Truth is shattered mirrors strewn in myriad bits, while each believes his little piece the whole to own. And so the history that we have as African American people, well, we just have these little teeny pieces, these little shards. We have a longing, an intellectual and academic curiosity. We have a need to honor our ancestors, to determine what places are important to us, what must be preserved, based on these little pieces that we'd like to put together into a full mirror instead of having just these little teeny shards. How do we reconstruct this mirror? So Dr. Jamila Moore Pugh wrote a chapter in a book called The Digital Black Atlantic. And her chapter is called Digital Reconnaissance. And I invite all of you to read it. You can find that chapter online. And it talks about how the importance of digital humanities in bringing this history together and to elevating and situating our histories beyond the local place. So the local places are really important starting points, but they aren't where we need to finish. And so then that brings us to, the importance of the Little Liberia site and of African American historic preservation in the first place. I did mention that it's really important for us to have talented, skilled, trained archaeologists. And as we started out as a grassroots organization that was trying to save a site, all we knew at that point, well, we knew that Charles Brillovich had brought us this history, and a history that was already growing more complex. We knew that it was of critical importance to save these houses that weren't recognized by local government as important at all. They were set for demolition. So the larger story still hadn't unfolded, but we knew that this was an important story and that this site would yield information. We were supported by the preservation community, both the National Trust for Historic Preservation and Preservation Connecticut in our efforts, by the Connecticut Freedom Trail as well. And again, how does a story get lost when it's so significant? It's hard to say. But what makes our site valuable and a real important treasure when it comes to African American sites, first of all, that it survived. Most of them don't survive. This one also not only survived, it survived on its original foundations. And the houses are made of the original materials. The inside of the Eliza house has sustained damage. The exterior is from the period of interest. The Mary Freeman house, interestingly enough, I still just marvel at it. It has original doors, original windows, and the houses were occupied in the 1980s. And I don't understand what kind of landlord keeps thumb latch doors when you can go down, well, you can go to Home Depot and replace them, right? You can, and the remnants of the fireplaces that weren't used. But because no one swapped out the interior, the houses have original doors, original windows, and that makes our site really special, that the interior is intact as well. On top of it all, we found artifacts. So some of the artifacts are pretty ordinary when you first look at them. So we have beer bottles, a liquor bottle, but these were found without excavation. These were simply found in eaves, under floors, without actually excavating the site. So we have to thank the Office of the State Archaeologist for all of the work that they have done for us over the years. Their work also allowed us to make the case that the houses should not be demolished. So Sarah Sportman and Nick Bellantoni have been working with us. Again, these were recovered from walls. And I like the pipe. It's made of wood from Northern Africa, and it still has teeth marks in it. So this is the artist's rendition of what the community looked like. And that's just for a point of reference, because that's what it looks like now. So we're very much involved in restoring the houses and trying to get people, once they know the history, to envision the redevelopment of the entire area. And the history of this site is entombed beneath all of this cement and beneath these empty lots. Part of the community would spill over into the utility land. And this was the condition that this neighborhood reflects. I mean, these were conscious choices. These weren't the people who lived there deciding, well, let's knock things down. Let's just, invite industries that are not clean or degrade the coastal community and the coastal environment. These were decisions that were taken by government. And as this area was concentrated with people of color, it was not valued as much. And the whole history of redlining and such also played a role. What we would like to do is create a climate resilient heritage, a cultural heritage park, which would include housing. But the first thing that has to be recognized is that this coastline that hugs the Little Liberia community, and this coastline that was so important to the people who live there, that it's of value and it needs to be respected. So I've stopped sharing my screen.
Thank you, Maisa. I really appreciate that. I have a quick question before we go to the audience. If you have any questions or comments, please leave it in the chat, and Maisa or myself will answer you. In regards to the restoration part or the redlining, that's what I would like to know. Redlining, can we actually, or can you actually pinpoint when redlining actually started and tell of the detriment of the redlining to the community?
Well, this is really interesting because one of the reasons that I think that the Little Liberia area, the 15 blocks, that footprint should be retained and developed is because it tells the story not just of Little Liberia, but all of the changes in that footprint over time. In other words, it tells a social history. It also tells an environmental history, a history of public policy, right? So Little Liberia was an early settlement. It was also an early victim of sort of urban redesign and urban planning. So the Bridgeport's economy was tied indirectly to the slave trade through investments, through banking, through all they the undergirding of the slave trade. And when it was clear, when the handwriting was on the wall, that this wasn't going to continue in this, it wouldn't be a source of the economy for the state, for the city, new ways had to be figured out. So we had developers in the area, people who wanted to make sure that the city thrived. P.T. Barnum was one of them, and they decided to turn Bridgeport into the equivalent of the Silicon Valley of its time, the industrial place of its time. And they looked and they recruited industry from different places and said, come to Bridgeport. Not only will we provide you with a place to build a state-of-the-art factory, we'll also provide you with a white workforce. And they didn't put it in those words, but there was a preference for white workers over black workers. So you have this time, like when people just before that had been being shipped to Liberia and other places. I mean, Liberia was a place that people wanted to go in order to have freedom and develop an economy in a place of their own. But it was a solution for governments that didn't want this buildup of Black people staying in the country. And it was true in Bridgeport as well. I laughed, there's an early article in a Bridgeport newspaper in the 1830s that's saying, hey, these Black people are building up around here. We've got to do something about them. And the editor says, I have a solution. We should establish a new country for them, but on this continent, because it will break us if we have to ship all of them over to Africa. So we can give them some space. We should establish a country for them, the country of Texas. So like the climate, it's hot. They're tough enough to hold their own there. And when slavery comes to an end, the free people who are already there, they'll know the ropes and they'll teach these other folks. Now, this was in a Bridgeport newspaper in the 1830s, right? So as they moved the factories into the South End, which was Little Liberia, Little Liberia was growing northward. It needed more space. The city itself was growing southward into the area. Then there was a recession that cost people their money. And between all of that, Little Liberia was dismembered. I mean, I'm sure there were other reasons as well, some of which were strict segregation laws that the state of Connecticut had. So basically, wherever white people worked and lived and went to school, Black people could no longer live and work and go to school there. So you saw people getting pushed. There was a hostile environment created in the South End. So one of the things that Barnum promised these industrialists was that they'd have an educated and healthy workforce. Wouldn't be like these tenements in New York City. We're going to create an Olmsted Park that people can get to without a carriage. And they can be healthy and there's no TV or internet or air conditioning back then. They can be healthy. We'll train people, we'll train women. And so you see people getting pushed out. But when you bring immigrants into an area also in a large number,
Mhm.
well, the immigrants were looked down on too, but not to the extent of Black people.
Correct.
Um, the country was steeped in beliefs in eugenics, and we were at the very bottom. The immigrants were above us. But what it did over time, especially as the industrialists, for a while they had mansions on the water, which these mansions then became part uh, of the University of Bridgeport, um, looked out on Seaside Park. Barnum had a mansion himself. As the industrialists moved away from the area, the laborers in the factories were left. The industry was dirty. Um, there were still Black people, but Black people weren't getting these jobs. Um, the entire area was regarded differently during the World Wars. Um, people Black folks came up in the Great Migration. They inhabited these areas. There had been housing projects, some of which were, intended for whites. GI Bill, they get to move out, white flight. So what's left in the South End? People of color, factories, and you see that the land and the people are in a space that is looked down upon,
Mhm.
and even the coastal environment is seen as a fair for degradation,
Mm.
environmental degradation. And so then you see the rise of environmental justice issues. But we can tell all of these stories um, of the relationship of people to one another, to
Mm.
public policy. We can tell cautionary tales about the environment and the use of resources,
Mhm.
all in the footprint of Little Liberia.
Wow, that's beautiful. That is definitely something worthwhile knowing, and it's definitely a legacy that needs to continue. And with that, I do have a question from Mariana. She wants to know, where do you see the center, the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center, in 10 years?
Oh, I love that question. I love that question. With the help of the state of Connecticut, um, the State Historic Preservation Office, DECD, the Department of Housing, and even the city of Bridgeport, they found ways of pulling together preservation monies and resilience monies. And first of all, we're starting restoration of the houses um, in June.
Nice.
So that's really exciting. We are hoping for a ribbon cutting um, around New Year or December, 2023 or New Year 2024.
Okay.
We have offices and a gallery public programming space downtown Bridgeport and installations of an exhibit in Housatonic Museum of Art. And what we want to do is bring all of this together in the South End.
Nice.
We intend to create um, we intend to create not just a historic site, but a cultural heritage site that
Mm.
includes a museum and a research center. We want to be the center for the digital humanities um, research that will happen over generations
Yeah.
to reassemble this mirror, the mirror of our experience of the African American diaspora. And we will also be telling the story of Indigenous people and the experiences within Little Liberia, um, which is a complicated
Mm.
story and a proud legacy as well.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Oh my goodness, that is exciting. I hope I'm still around to see all of that happening. While we're waiting to see if there are any other questions or comments, I would like to invite you to next month's conversation at noon, where we will hear about Prudence Crandall and Sarah Mayweather. And in June, we will hear about the perils of James Pennington. So, the legacy of the Canterbury Female Boarding School will be Tuesday, May 24th at noon, and the perils of Pennington with Andre Kitt, the Great Heart Griot storyteller, will be Tuesday, June 28th. The executive director of the Prudence Crandall Museum, Joan DiMartino, will do the legacy of the Canterbury Female Boarding School. As we're checking to see if there are any questions or comments, Maisa, would you like to give us any closing remarks about what's upcoming with the Eliza and Mary and Eliza Freeman Center? Anything coming upwards that the public can know about or join in?
Right. So one of the things that we do is we like to present historical narratives that also highlight contemporary issues. So, and I just noticed a little while ago as we were coming on the air, I got an alert that Harvard University is allocating, was it a huge amount of money to study its ties to slavery. On May 5th, we are presenting the film Free Renty at the Bijou Theater in Bridgeport.
Yeah, I was getting ready to ask, is that
right.
will they do anything with Free Renty? Nice.
Right. So again, this is a historical story with that highlights the issue of reparations, but also has a local tie. Tamara Lanier is a Connecticut woman. Her lawyers are from Koskov, which is a Bridgeport law firm, and they're suing Harvard University to recover the rights to artifacts that are part of her family history.
Yes. That is
documentary.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, again, like you said, about reparations and things that are due to the descendants of those who were enslaved. So that is definitely history unfolding before our very eyes. So hopefully, yes.
Right. I'm sorry. After the film, the filmmaker will be there, David Grubin, lawyers from Koskov, Josh Koskov, and my own brother, Preston Tisdale, who are working on the case, and Tamara Lanier. So Q&A after with the primary people involved in this.
Awesome. Well, hopefully you will get a great turnout for that. And that's May 5th at what time?
At 7:00.
At 7 p.m. At
the
where?
Bijou Theater in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
At the Bijou Theater.
Yeah, you can buy tickets online at their ticket office.
Awesome. Well, Maisa, thank you so very much for taking the time to come and speak with us today. And it is a wonderful project that is happening there. And hopefully we will get to have you back to get an update once all of the restorations has been done. So thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, this is the end of our conversation today at noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. Thank you all for tuning in. And again, next month's talk will be about the females of oh my goodness. We will be talking with Joan DiMartino, the legacy of the Canterbury Female Boarding School, Tuesday, May 24th at noon. Thank you again for joining us. Until the next time.